This is the BioCentury Show.
Brought to you by the 5th East-West Biopharma Summit in South Korea. In March, explore how to globalize Asia innovation and connect with key players across Asia's innovation arc, from India to China to Japan.
Welcome to the BioCentury Show. I'm Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence at BioCentury, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Jacqueline Fok, an investment director focused on life sciences and health tech at SoftBank's Vision Fund based in London. SoftBank Vision Fund is one of the world's largest growth equity platforms with over $208 billion in total fair value and a portfolio of over 470 companies across 3 funds. Prior to SoftBank, Jackie was an investment manager at IP Group, a FTSE-listed deep tech and life sciences investor specialized in building businesses from leading scientific research in the UK. She started her career as a research scientist at AstraZeneca's Oncology R&D unit in Cambridge, UK. Jackie has a BS in biochemistry and a Master of Research in Cancer Biology from Imperial College London, and a PhD in Cancer Biology from the Institute of Cancer Research. Jackie, I'm really happy to welcome you to the show.
Thanks, Stephen. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so let's get started. So SoftBank, obviously, is a very well-known investor. Usually, though, I think most people associate SoftBank with areas such as tech. Maybe it's less well-known for its life sciences portfolio. So maybe I think the best place to start off is, could you give us a brief background on SoftBank's strategic vision, pardon the pun, in life sciences there, and sort of what you guys are looking at?
Sure, of course. As you mentioned, SoftBank is best known for their technology investing, specifically in category-defining tech companies like OpenAI and Uber. I would say our approach to life sciences and health tech is really no different. The core belief is that technology can really unlock the capability to improve human health. So our investment focus is pretty broad across biotech therapeutics, research tools, diagnostics, medtech, and digital health, and really spend a lot of time with companies where there's a true enabling tech at its core. The Vision Fund itself has actually been active since 2017, and specifically in the life sciences, in those early years, investments include, companies across that breadth: Guardant Health, 10x Genomics, Relay, Vividian Therapeutics, and I think all of these companies are good examples of those that have really built a technology and a capability that changed what's possible in their category. And I think continuing on from that, we're currently investing out of Fund 2, that's about a $100 billion fund. And what we are focused on and are excited about are those companies at the intersection of technology and biology, specifically those that are utilizing and applying AI and ML. And as we all know, human biology is very complicated, but the way to study it is to generate some really rich data. And I think that's where some of these computational techniques really shine. And so specifically our biotech investment strategy, we focused on investments in platform technologies at clinical stage. And the idea here is that if the lead program proves out in the clinic, it doesn't just create one asset, but unlocks a broader and deeper pipeline of programs. And so kind of across the fund, whether technology or life sciences, we really aspire to back these types of companies that are really having ambitious, long-term, generational, category defining goals. Yeah.
Sure. I think we'll come back and we'll spend more time on the AI aspect a little later, but I did want to sort of hone in on one thing you mentioned about just with regard to the size of the fund. I mean, obviously, the Vision Fund invests across multiple sectors, but we're talking orders of magnitude in terms of size larger than any of your typical sort of specialist biotech funds. So, do you feel any sort of pressure to prioritize sort of like really big checks, like larger allocations, either, when we're talking about growth stage companies or in like these mega sort of Series A round sort of company formation projects? How do you approach that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point you make. I think the life sciences and health tech portfolio we manage in and of itself is pretty sizable, around 3.5 billion AUM. I think, however, within this larger SoftBank Vision Fund, there's an appreciation that different sectors and different types of businesses require different levels of capitalization to reach the value inflection. And so, for example, the risk profile of a growth stage enterprise SaaS company growing its sales and marketing efforts are very different from a biotech company testing its lead program in phase 2. And I think the beauty of the Vision Fund portfolio is that there's this diversification of risk across the different sectors, and with some specific sectors like biotech where the upside is much more profound, right? So I think that's all to say that there's not really any pressure for us to prioritize larger allocations. I think we choose investment sizes that match the opportunity. And a good example of this is our, back in 24, we made a $200 million investment into a company called Tempus AI. This was a later stage revenue generating precision medicine platform. And the round was designed to remove any kind of financing distraction for the company as it was working through a value inflection, and in their case was an IPO. And I think the purpose of having this larger check also enabled a broader strategic angle for SoftBank, which was to set up a JV so that we could bring their technology to Japan. So I think hopefully this kind of ties together how we think about check sizes and kind of relative opportunity here.
Sure. So what is your perspective? I mean, I know there's been some debate around sort of the strategy, I guess if you could want to call it one, of these sort of mega rounds. What is your perspective on that? Are they a good strategy for building companies?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that mega rounds are inherently good or bad strategies. They're pretty situational.
Sure.
I think for these larger rounds, I think they work best with teams that have really lived through clinical development in the relevant TA or indication, and therefore can budget pretty realistically and execute to that next inflection point in a really capital efficient way. And I think the advantage of working with these types of experienced teams is that they're more attuned to when to parallel track certain activities at risk, especially in really highly competitive indications. So, for example, green lighting a manufacturing spend ahead of some preclinical data, but that because of their experience, can be quite confident about how that would read out. So I think being able to parallel track some of these activities is only enabled by some of these larger financing rounds to enable that speed of execution. So I think that's a particular case where it can be quite helpful. And I think another point I'd like to mention is that there are just certain modalities, indications that are quite capital incentive by nature. So like say cell and gene therapy manufacturing, large TAs like cardiometabolic or I&I or some oncology ones. So I think that those companies with those types of ambitions, I think it makes sense for a larger round. But,
Sure.
to kind of tie it all up, I think the best way to probably balance adequate funding with capital efficiency, like to your question, is to really back the right teams. So the
Sure.
round sizes size to the milestones rather than it just being, a headline.
Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point that I think often gets maybe lost in the conversation, is having the experience and the team that knows kind of when to be aggressive and when to be, when to really be capital efficient. And maybe that's a good segue into one of the mega round sort of investments that you guys did that, was a really big success. That's obviously obesity company Metsera, where SoftBank was, I believe you were investor in both the $290 million Series A round and the $215 million Series B round.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously those came, before Pfizer acquired Metsera last fall for $10 billion, of which 7.6 billion, was upfront. But I believe you have an even longer history with that technology and that platform prior to even the SoftBank investment, right? So maybe could you tell us a little bit about your Metsera story?
Sure. Really happy to talk about this topic. Reflecting on it, Metsera really became one of the big stories last year, right? It was such a rare situation to see such a public and intense bidding war for a biotech company. I was very much on the edge of my seat every day in those couple of weeks.
I think a lot of us were.
Yeah. But I think what's lesser known is the origin story for Metsera's technology and assets, which came from an Imperial College spinout, Zyhip, that was founded by Professor Steve Bloom in the early 2010s. And Steve Bloom was an early pioneer in studying GLP-1s and all its related incretin hormones, and for many decades have been studying how these peptides influence the gut-brain axis and how certain combinations were more effective in regulating satiety or body weight, right? And I was familiar with a lot of this innovative work that was going on at Sci-Hip, as it was a portfolio company of IP Group, which is the UK university, deep tech focused fund I previously was at.
Right.
And I think for Metsera, like for many companies in our industry, for many events in our industry, I think timing is everything. And I think there were a couple of factors that coalesced to kind of produce or enable such large Series A and Series B rounds for this particular company. So I think a couple of points. One was when semaglutide launched for weight loss in 2021. That was around the time when the Bloom Lab made those breakthrough discoveries, finding that a certain chemistry enabled ultra long acting peptides,
Okay.
potentially improving upon the weekly. And then it was around that time as well when the ex-medicines companies team at Population Health Partners, Clive Meanwell, Whit Bernard and co., these guys being steeped thinking about how to improve and develop assets for large populations like obesity and diabetes. They were at that moment on the search for differentiated assets to bring to the clinic themselves. And I think another third kind of key factor was the results from Novo's SELECT study, which is the cardiovascular outcome study with SEMA, where they showed these broader and long-term benefits of this class of drugs, not just for weight loss, but for other things. So I think all of these factors really came together to create almost a gravitational pull for Metsera when they came around to this financing, finding investors around the table that not only had the balance sheet, but also the conviction to fund such an ambitious endeavor, really to compete against Novo and Lilly. And so I think that's quite, you couldn't really have crafted a better story. It kind of really just came together for them. And I think one last piece I wanted to say, at least from the SoftBank perspective, is that, beyond it having kind of conviction in their scientific approach and the quality of their science, I think a very happy coincidence was that one of my colleagues, John Shui, had worked with the PHP folks in his previous life. And so this investment was very much a team effort for us at SoftBank, really knowing the team, and also having confidence in the science.
Right. Yeah. No, it was a wonderful story. And as you said, I think it was built from the ground up to be competitive, and you could see in their clinical program that it was really designed to provide something that would be competitive, and why it obviously ended up garnishing the valuation that it did. So, it was a really remarkable story.
Yeah,
but
and
I think
the outcome of it coming into now Pfizer's hands is fantastic in that they really have the firepower to really push hard on the development of the multiple programs actually Metsera had, not just the injectables, but maybe even the orals. And I think they have the pockets to really deliver on proving out the monthly dosing, and then maybe even achieve the broader labels that can, I guess the end goal really is to lower overall system costs for this class of drugs and ultimately expand access to patients. So I think, Pfizer was a good outcome for Metsera.
Yeah, for sure. Well, great. Well, Jackie, we're going to take a short break here, and we will be right back.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by the 5th East-West Biopharma Summit in South Korea. An arc of innovation is emerging across Asia, and Western biopharma leaders are taking note, from cross-border deals to new co's. In March 2026, the 5th BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Biopharma Summit visits South Korea for the first time. Meet the biopharma leaders putting Korea innovation on the global map. Learn why Korea has become a clinical trial and manufacturing hub. Discover if Korea is the next hotspot for new co-formation. Plus meet biopharma innovators from India to Singapore to China and Japan. Register now at biocenturyeastwest.com.
Welcome back to the BioCentury Show. We are chatting with Jackie Fok, Investment Director at SoftBank Vision Fund. So, Jackie, we were just talking about your experience with Metsera and how some of that technology came out of the UK. Um, Now, obviously, there have been a lot of examples, especially in obesity, of new company formations for, or company building. A lot of times these opportunities are coming out of Asia, China in
Mhm.
particular. But as you mentioned, Metsera is a great example of, stuff coming out of the UK in life sciences. So what's your perspective on what the opportunities are that the UK brings to our industry?
So I've spent most of my adult life here in the UK, and I would say I'm going to answer this question definitely wearing a UK hat and maybe waving a UK flag.
Sure,
Um,
that's fine.
I do believe that the UK is a perfect breeding ground for biotech, and because there's strong fundamentals here, right? Besides the
Mm,
obvious, which is the world-class universities and research institutions, and the fact that it's the NHS that exists here, an integrated health system that in theory should enable kind of easier clinical trials. I think one of our greatest assets is the current and legacy pharma presence here in the UK, especially when it comes to things like finding talent for building biotech companies, whether you're looking for folks at the exec level or lab scientists that have really been industrially trained. I think
hmm
the second piece are being able to find experienced consultants and advisors for building your biotech company. I think you can often persuade pretty highly experienced ex-pharma folks, even though maybe some of them are on final salary pensions, to kind of come and work on some compelling science in this biotech that you're building. And then I think the last piece about having legacy and current pharma here is that it's important for training up the next generation of scientists, learning how to work in a particular way. And I think maybe a lot of that stems from my own personal experience, where
mm,
I did my PhD down at the ICR, where we benefited, I guess, from Pfizer's Sandwich site shutting down and kind of absorbing a good number of these ex large pharma scientists to kind of learn from. And I think that was really formative for me and how I approach doing research. And so, like, that's one point about like traditional biotech and pharma. I think UK is great for that. I think outside of traditional biotech, there's also the AI talent piece that we really have to mention in this day and age.
right.
DeepMind was founded here in London in 2010, have had a long presence here, and they've actually developed a whole generation of AI scientists and engineers that have worked on some of the hardest biological problems like protein folding. So
Right.
perhaps it's not really a surprise, at least from what I'm seeing, a trend of this new crop of tech bio companies, some of
Mm.
whom are primarily funded by US kind of early stage investors, setting up shop and hiring here in London just because of the talent here.
Right, right. No, no, that's an excellent point. And, I fully appreciate you having your, UK hat on as I myself have been here, for 20 plus years. But I think we also need to maybe, address, that while there are lots of opportunities, there are some challenges, right? And so, I mean, can I just maybe get your opinion on what maybe those primary challenges are that, could still be improved upon, in terms of just helping to raise the UK's status in terms of its sort of globally competitive positioning, maybe relative to China or other hubs in Europe?
Hmm. Yeah, I guess if we're talking about the UK being competitive to be a top tier geography, to establish
Mm,
and run a biotech company and kind of do innovative research, there are definitely some areas that can further incentivize this, and maybe some of this sits around capital efficiency, capital availability, and just general infrastructure.
hmm
Maybe at a very basic level, I think the R&D tax credits here in the UK are meaningful. I think they're better than
mm,
the UK, but maybe not as attractive to places like Australia, where
mm,
I think effectively you can get up to something like 43% cash back, right, on your R&D spend. So this is potentially an area to work on for more pull incentives to stay
hmm
in the UK and kind of continue doing work here. Um, on kind of more on the regulatory and maybe clinical development side of things, I think the MHRA kind of on par with other agencies in terms of, you know, timelines and feedback, but it seems that the timelines to set up trials here in the UK are very protracted,
right.
maybe even up to a year. And I think it seems like the UK government are making efforts here to kind of improve and simplify some of the paperwork and contracting processes that it takes to kind of start doing trials here in the NHS. So
Right.
I'm looking for that as a potential point for improvement. And I think lastly, like that point about capital availability, I think historically UK companies have been fine raising kind of seed Series A financings, but found it challenging for kind of scale up capital. And
Right.
but what I'm hearing now, at least, is that a lot of these UK-based early seed Series A investors are being more proactive with building syndicates with US investors way earlier on, so that you kind of they're in the door and they kind of know the teams and know the progress of the science. And so I think that hopefully kind of helps these companies bridge that gap from kind of smaller early clinical requirements of financing to kind of larger ones. But I think,
Right.
yeah, I think altogether, we should really lean into what the UK is really good at. I don't think we'll be able to win on speed. You mentioned China. I think countries like that definitely have an advantage. But I think we can definitely and should definitely win on originality. Coming back to Metsera, some of that deep academic research that's been funded here by Innovate UK and kind of other UK funding bodies for years, and also our know-how and I think recognition of what quality evidence looks like or clinical evidence, and I think from the get-go developing assets with data that's designed for FDA, EMA, and MHRA approval.
Right. Right.
Mm.
Yeah. So, I did want to come back to one thing that you mentioned, Jackie, around sort of the AI opportunity in the UK. You obviously also had mentioned how AI was a major theme of investment for SoftBank. And so I wanted to dive a bit more deeper into this one. Is there a specific application of AI in healthcare that you're focused on when you're doing your, due diligence on investment opportunities?
Yeah. Maybe we can kind of take AI in healthcare and AI in biotech a little bit separately.
Sure.
I think
Okay.
what's interesting for us, because we have a broader lens on technology and compute and AI and human health, is actually to see the rate of uptake of AI tools in healthcare being taken up at a rate that's much faster, it feels at least, to kind of AI tools in biotech and pharma. I think, yes, in biotech and pharma, they were taken up probably over a decade ago, but in terms of broad utilization, I feel like we're still in the testing period for at least some of the pharma companies that are partnering with these companies. Whereas on the AI and healthcare side of things, depending on what surveys and what stats you read, up to 70% of US physicians are using some type of AI tool in their practice today. And that's up from 40% 2 years ago, or there's data suggesting that at least 20% of all hospital systems in the US are already buying commercial licenses for AI tools. And that's up from 3% 2 years ago. So these numbers are pretty staggering in terms of the rate of uptake, and people are actually paying for it, right? So I think as a team, because our focus is so broad, we have been spending more time on a lot of these AI healthcare administrative applications. And more so just because they're lower hanging fruit, lower hanging in terms of lower regulatory hurdle. We're not making any clinical decisions. And I think with these types of AI applications, it's much easier to see a clear and immediate ROI versus, say, AI in drug development, which, to prove that out, by nature of it, at least a good number of years kind of show that in the clinic.
Yeah. So I would like to, though, drill down on that biotech application in development if we can. I mean, what's your view kind of where the role of AI in drug development is going? I mean, are medicinal chemists, kind of going the way of software engineers? Are they going to be obsolete in a couple of years? How do you see this moving?
I see your point, and I can kind of understand some of the concerns there. But I think ultimately the end goal would be that some of these AI tools would make these chemists and scientists dramatically more productive than they are today. And really, AI is not really a replacement for human judgment, at least not for a long time. Like with all AI tools, I think the challenge is to build trust, and having that quality evidence based for the users such as a medicinal chemist, to really believe it's improved accuracy and performance. And so kind of your question about, are we going to see replacement of medicinal chemists in the near term? Definitely not. And I think only now are we seeing an actual sizable pipeline of clinical assets from this kind of Gen 1 AI drug discovery company now in phase 2, phase 3. So until we see the results of that, and an N of 1 or N of 2, N of 3 are not really going to satisfy, I think, the scientists that we all are. I think it will take, a good number of years before we get a, significant shift in reducing workforce, if that's the question.
Sure. So where do you see the biggest impact for AI's sort of application for the biotech sector?
Yeah.
And this can be long term. We can be looking over a long term horizon here. I'm just curious to see what you think is the biggest impact.
Yeah, I know that as an industry or as a VC community, we spend a lot of time with companies working on the R of the R&D, or like the discovery stage of the R&D process, where yes, identifying better targets, designing better molecules can shorten and contract the timelines to IND. But I think less investment and less attention so far has been paid to the D side of R&D, which is where the lion's share of the cost does end up falling.
Right.
So I believe that let's not put an X to it, but in a good number of years, like maybe more in the near term, there will be some simple efficiency gains in terms of clinical development, whether it's protocol optimization, selecting the right sites that have better enrollment. I think that is achievable. I think the biggest prize will be materially improving trial probability of success in POS. And to kind of, how do we get there, right? I think maybe this is a good point in time to be talking about this, because here we are with the advent of transformer-based architecture that's enabled, for example, these large language models. It's unlocked the ability to pre-train or train what we call foundation models. These are kind of generalizable models that can work on unlabeled data, vast amounts of it, longitudinal, multimodal, and this can be, patient records, images, omics. And all of this data has existed and been available, but just not been pulled together in this way, in this context. And you can imagine these general models being able to predict disease trajectories. And so I would imagine for the industry, if the models are actually that highly performing, they can be exceptionally good at informing what are the appropriate endpoints, who are the appropriate patients to recruit, at which sites, with what biomarkers of response. And I think that's the holy grail, right? To really move the needle from 1 in 20 drugs being successful from phase 1 to approval, but say 1 in 10 or maybe 1 in 5. But that's still several years away, I think.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think it's fascinating. I mean, I think there are lots of ways we could go there, but I did want to make sure that we had some time to talk about another subject that I know you're quite passionate about. And this is with regard to leadership, and I guess in particular, sort of women in leadership roles, sort of especially CEOs and in the investment community. So, I mean, I guess with regard to CEOs and company leadership, at least our observation is that, it's certainly been on the rise in the past few years. I think it's been improving. But at the same time, many companies are now, some companies are rolling back sort of DEI initiatives. And so do you think that's going to impact that trend?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's important to say kind of diversity in kind of all forms, whether it's gender or ethnicity and other things. I think there's good enough data supporting that it leads to better quality decisions, it improves financial performance, leads to better innovation. So I don't think that needs to be said. And I think representation really matters, right? Having leaders in CEO positions, chair positions, partner positions that look like you and that you identify with, I think kind of helps retain the current cohort of leaders and also inspires the next generation of it. And I think you're right. I think there has been pressure, especially for US companies, to visibly soften the DEI initiatives. At least publicly on their company websites or maybe on their earnings calls. But I think, and I optimistically believe that this is more of a blip, and that the trend is still moving in a positive direction, where because of the underlying pressures of talent competition, for example, there's going to be a continued push for broader diversity and representation. And for me specifically, I think seeing the incoming Takeda CEO, Julie Kim, being an Asian
Mm,
woman is particularly exciting. There hasn't been, an
sure.
Asian female CEO before for a big pharma company. So I think examples like these are what is important, and we can only continue working on that.
Mm. What about on the investor sort of banking sort of side? I think the perception we have is that maybe it hasn't been as good in terms of the leadership roles. Is that a correct perspective, or what are you seeing there?
Yeah, I would say maybe the perception is broadly correct. I'm not really sure about the pace, but
Mm,
there is some pretty good data, at least from the BVCA here in the UK, showing that at least percentage of senior investment professionals who identify as women are steadily growing, at least in the last couple of years. But maybe one of the confounding factors for why the perceived pace is slow could be that drug development is slow, and therefore investment cycles are long, and it could take
mm,
an aspiring junior female invest partner over a decade to really build a track record to become a GP. And I think so.
sure.
I think what helps here are all the different efforts that folks are really pushing to kind of build networks, build groups that raise awareness and community for this. And some of those I'll call out are like the Biotech CEO Sisterhood,
Mm,
Breaking 7%. I run a small life sciences VC network here in the UK with a couple of friends, some kind of informal quarterly meetups. And I think all of this comes together and is incredibly helpful to build networks for unlocking deals, referrals, and sponsorship and whatnot.
wonderful. Excellent. Well, we're nearly out of time, Jackie. So one last question for you, if that's all right. I mean, I know, gosh, I can't believe it's already March. It feels like the year just started in some ways. But sort of looking ahead this year, what are some themes or major catalysts that that you're going to be looking out for this year? Maybe if you could give us a few from your portfolio companies, just call out a few things if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. I can give you a couple of things. Um, Definitely looking forward to seeing some of the GLP-1 amylin combination data that Pfizer/Metsera will be putting out hopefully this year, and how that
Hmm.
compares with Lilly's. I know that, Stephen, you're pretty steeped in kind of the obesity space yourself. The
I'm also
other,
looking forward to that very much.
yes, and the other one is I'm looking forward to seeing the evolution of how tech bio business models move. There were some very impressive deals that were announced at the time of JP Morgan this year with regards to model licensing, and
Mm,
some sums that were somewhat unprecedented. So I really look forward to seeing how other pharmas react. And as we all know, there often are a lot of things happen three times in a row kind of thing. So let's see on that. And um, for a portfolio specifically, no particular favorites and in no particular order. There are a
of
couple of
course.
names that are definitely worth mentioning, one of which is Encoded Therapeutics. They're a next generation
Mm,
gene therapy company with their lead program in Dravet syndrome. They announced some very exciting clinical data and at the end of last year, looking at substantial improvements, not just in seizure endpoints, but also neurodevelopmental outcomes for these young children. And I think, this is very much a watch this space company, and that they will be putting forward some more data, towards the middle of this year. One other company too is Umoja Therapeutics. They
mm,
have two in vivo CAR T clinical stage programs for HEMOC and autoimmune at the moment. Looking forward to some of the clinical data from that. And then lastly, we have a portfolio company, Ventus Therapeutics. They have a
mm.
first-gen CGAS small molecule inhibitor in development for lupus at the moment, and looking forward to some of that clinical data at the end of this year.
Yeah, wonderful. Great. Well, I believe that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much, Jackie, for joining us. Really appreciated enjoyed the conversation. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. We hope you'll join us again as we've got some great upcoming guests on the BioCentury Show. So thank you very much.
Brought to you by the 5th East-West Biopharma Summit in South Korea. In March, explore how to globalize Asia innovation and connect with key players across Asia's innovation arc, from India to China to Japan.
Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury Show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.